Hello, everyone. I'm Lorraine Nowlin of WDI USA. I am the facilitator of the Black Women's Caucus, and I serve on the board of directors. Domestic violence is a horrific problem in our country. We must provide safe spaces for women during the most dangerous time for them when they are trying to escape their abusive male partners. Are women in danger of losing those protected spaces? Nancy Docktor, the WDI USA Arkansas State contact, explored this very issue in her research, No Longer Women Only: How Gender Identity Ideology Has Changed Women's Shelters. Nancy, thank you so much for being with me today. Tell me about your history with radical feminism.
Well, I think it's limited, actually. Back in the late 60s and early 70s, when I was in my undergrad years, I participated in women's consciousness raising in a couple of cities where I lived. And then I also lived in a women's collective of feminists for the better part of a year. But, that was really the extent of it. I can't say I was any sort of activist in any real sense.
So how did you get involved in WDI USA?
I think it was brewing for a while. My concerns about transgenderism, I'd heard about it for years. I mean, just like a lot of people who change their sex, have surgeries and all that sort of thing. I've always considered myself a liberal person, so I didn't understand it. In like about 10 or 12 years ago, I worked at an academic health center, a university where health professionals are trained. And I worked in the diversity center for a brief time. So I learned all about transgender and transgender health and the Human Rights Campaign and all their worthy, quote unquote, work. And I had a young, really my boss, whose daughter claimed that she was trans and had breast surgery as a teenager and all of that. I was always very unsettled by that sort of thing, but I just put it on the back burner. I mean, like, people born in the wrong body. It just didn't seem believable.
Right.
So I thought about it a long time. Then in 2020, early 2023, two things happened. One, somewhere along that, about that time, Will Thomas, the male swimmer at the University of Pennsylvania, made the news. I guess he's so darn gigantic, they could hardly ignore him in the news. And that really struck me as a horribly outrageous, unfair thing. And then also, I was a reader of Matt Taibbi's Substack, an independent journalist, and he did a great interview with Kara Dansky, the outgoing, WDI president, and she warned about the dangers of transgenderism and the harm to it was not stopped if it got worse. And I learned about her first book, The Abolition of Sex, which I promptly ordered and read. And then I read the work of Kathleen Stock, Helen Joyce, Abigail Schreier, Hannah Barnes. I just did a deep dive. And thought, well, I've got to, what can I do? This is horrible. And so WDI, I signed the declaration also, and I thought, well, they look like they really know what they're doing. They're really clear on their positions, which is often not true of organizations. They seem like they've got great leadership. They seem well organized. They're doing great work. How about them? So so at some point in 2023, I said, reached out and did a little this and that here and there. And then I said, as far as this project goes, I offered my services, you might say, to the board. I love gathering facts and writing them up. What can I do? And pitched a few ideas to them. And they came back with a suggestion that I look into males, women in women's shelters.
Wow. Speaking of that research, what did you discover about why men are allowed in these shelters in the first place, and how is that decided?
Okay, well, first, I'd like to explain a little bit about the project itself and my approach. As a researcher, my first impulse was, one, there's a national organization called domesticshelters.org, and I thought, and they're an umbrella organization with contacts on their website of all the known shelters in states all across the country. I thought, well, I'll just reach out to them. I sent a list of questions,
Mm-hmm.
identified myself as a researcher. Well, nobody wanted to talk to me. I tried several times. Then I tried calling shelters to try to talk to administrators with the
Mm-hmm.
same approach. They didn't want to talk to me. So then I thought, well, what am I going to do? And so I thought, well, I'm going to call the hotlines. And I felt like I was perfectly justified in coming from the standpoint of a pretense, a ruse, to first,
Mm-hmm.
either I would just start talking and firing questions at the person, like, are men allowed in the shelter? Why? Just to talk, talk that way.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't introduce myself as a researcher. Or I would say, I'm a friend of
Mm-hmm.
a woman who may need shelter soon, and she wanted me to call your shelter and get some information, and she does not want to stay in a shelter where there are males. That almost in every case. So eventually I got pretty, some good data, qualitative data on 23
Mm-hmm.
shelters around the country, mainly in cities, large and small cities. And of those, 4 do not admit males.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's a 5th one that admits males if that male has been fully castrated, but no
Mm-hmm.
male has taken him up on that.
Wow.
From what, because I did eventually talk to the administrator there, had a good conversation with her. So, what I learned, well, first of all, when I'd say, does your shelter admit males? They'd say, oh, no. And I said, you mean, real men, who have male genitals or what? And they'd say, oh, you're talking about well, yeah, trans women. We do. There are trans ladies, and they're right off, they would say, oh, we don't discriminate. That was what they were really quick to say in most all cases of these shelters, that of the 19 that admit women. And really what it came down to was, one, I've also found out that housing and urban development, federal agency has a requirement that if an agency, a local agency that provides housing, which includes women's shelters, if they're to get federal funding, they have to let males, anybody who claims a male identity, into a women's shelter. And furthermore, they can't be isolated from the women because that stigmatizes them and
Wow.
is to them emotionally. So I knew that likely was one factor. And in
Mm-hmm.
3 cases, I was able to ask that question I eventually talked to the administrators of these
Right.
shelters, don't let men in, and they say, oh, no, we don't take funding. And they really clear on their values and that they just are against it. And they're fine with, they say, we're fine without their money, and our funders are, our board's fine and everything. So that's their position. I didn't get to systematically ask that question of every hotline worker at every shelter. Eventually they'd
Right.
sort of lose patience with me, so I didn't get all my questions answered across the board. So that's
Mm-hmm.
one factor. The other thing is just ideological capture of these people, whether they sincerely believe it or not.
Wow.
They defended that policy and
Mm.
practice. There were 2 women that admitted to me that they didn't like it either, but that was the policy, and they can't do anything about it. One was in
Mm-hmm.
Washington State and said, that's the law here. You're going to get in big trouble if you don't let men in. But all
Mm-hmm.
the rest, and of those that defended it, some of them got really defensive.
Mm-hmm.
Come back with things like, well, we don't discriminate. Males are victims of violence too. Well, sure they are, and they deserve some safe place to go, but you don't put them in
Right.
the same place with women. That's a different issue. It was silly of them, but that's, they just came back with whatever. And
Mm-hmm.
and then there were some that were just really cool in their response. I felt like they were the true believers in the
Wow.
ideology. So, it was it was, so I think those 2 factors were at play,
Wow.
the housing, money, and
Mm-hmm.
just how much this ideology has
Right.
really permeated everything.
So, were you able to find out when they do have men in these shelters, are they put in the same dorm, or what would be the sleeping arrangements and things like that?
Yeah, well, okay, I found out that in most cases at most shelters, they're set up to have little private apartments for
Hmm.
single women. There's some where two women or more share a space, or there's a
Right.
suite, with a bathroom in between, that kind of thing. Um, there was one, though, however, was a dorm-like situation with 36 beds. Okay, so the ones that had multiple occupants in a room, whether it was a dorm situation or a little
Mhm.
apartment, I asked them, I said, well, what about a male? One of these so-called trans people, males that would the woman have any say, any guarantee that
Right.
she would not be forced to share sleeping space with males? And there was no guarantee. It was like, you're going to take who you get as a roommate.
Oh my.
And I did, in a few cases with the private apartments, I got to ask, well, what about, can you lock the door from the inside? And a few said yes, a few said no. I didn't really get around to asking that question systematically. I mean, there were other things to be talked about, and it didn't. I'd like to have known that more
Yeah.
fully. But women were, in my mind, were vulnerable. Now, as far as the other spaces in the
Hmm.
shelter, the kitchens, the dining halls, the day room or living room, the hallways, those were shared with
Wow.
everybody. The bathroom, there were no multi-stall or multi-person showers.
Hmm.
Um, I didn't find that to be the case anywhere.
Right.
But nonetheless, to me, it seemed like there was plenty of opportunity for a male who wanted to do harm to a woman or harass her could. I mean, there aren't eyes everywhere. And so,
Wow.
she was going to be vulnerable to me. And just, of course, just the fact that a male was present can be really
Mm.
difficult for a woman who's been abused to have
Right.
him there.
Right. So, just to clarify, did you notice that they really weren't making any considerations for women that suffered this trauma?
That was well, I felt like superficially.
Okay.
Again, I felt like, I didn't hear anybody that said when I said, have there been problems? How do the women feel about it? Those were my questions on that topic. I mean, what are you doing to ensure the safety, not to mention the privacy and dignity of
Right.
these women? They all denied there'd ever been any problems.
Right. Right.
Um, Number one, they were going to
Hmm.
admit to anything if there had been.
Hmm.
And some of them mentioned things like, well, we have strict rules, we have a
Hmm.
zero tolerance policy for violence.
Hmm.
One mentioned security cameras, one mentioned that
Right.
they had security personnel on site.
Hmm.
But the thing is, I thought later, I was trying not to get in too much back and forth with people, but I did try my
Yeah.
patience as time went on. I thought, okay, here's a woman who finally mustered up enough courage to
Hmm.
break away from her abuser to go to a shelter. But she's got a history of abuse, of
Hmm.
acquiescing to a violent male.
Hmm.
So here she is. Considers herself lucky to
Right.
get a space in a shelter. Most of the ones I called, they were full. So
Hmm.
here she comes. She may be flat broke. She may not have a car. She may not have a job. Her future's uncertain. She may have kids whose safety she has to consider. If she
Hmm.
complains too much up front or something, she doesn't like it, while
Hmm.
she's there,
Right.
and other women aren't willing to band together and really raise a ruckus about this, and she's a lone complainer and she could risk her space there.
Yes.
So how
Wow.
likely are people, she's these women, what,
Hmm.
presumably, have been forced to have sex with the man when
Wow.
they didn't want to in the past, and now they're in a situation. And when I was doing my work, I looked around for any reports of that kind of thing, and I did find at two shelters in Canada, there were news reports. I think they were in the
Hmm.
Toronto Star about
Oh,
that very thing. Males who claim to be women in shelters who raped
wow.
women when they were there. And I would ask the women later, eventually, I would say, there are a lot of bad actors these days, men getting in spaces that should be female
Right.
only. And it's their presence there is risky, and
Mm.
it's it's wrong. And how do you feel about that? And they would just
Right.
deny that there are any problems. And I asked them, well, how do you know somebody's, going to harm them? Which I think is beside the point. Men shouldn't be there anyway. But
Right.
I did ask, oh, well, we have our vetting process and we just
Mhm.
take people's word for it. If they say
Mhm.
they're a woman, they're a woman. It's all
Right.
about gender ID. If you identify, that's the truth.
Right. Wow. Um, have you noticed any regional patterns of shelters that do or don't allow men? For example, in the Northeast, were they more likely to allow? In the South, were they more likely to not allow? Have you noticed anything like that?
No, and of course it was a small sample, and it
Mhm.
certainly wasn't, conducted randomly as far as,
Right.
regional balance or anything like that. So, but no, I mean, one of the four shelters that don't allow um, males, one's Baltimore, which isn't considered the Northeast, I
Right.
understand, but on the East Coast,
Mhm.
Chicago,
Wow.
um, Boise, Idaho, and Memphis, Tennessee, and then the
Mhm.
one that requires that a male be fully castrated to be admitted is in Little Rock.
Wow.
Um, so no, I didn't notice
Mhm.
anything like that. Maybe it's a larger sample, but I knew of I connected with a woman briefly on X, and then I lost contact with her who was in New York, who was homeless, who's a feminist,
Mhm.
and she maintained she'd just gotten out of a shelter, and she said men it was crawling with males, and that was New York City.
Oh my
So,
gosh.
you know, I don't know about
Mhm.
that. I just don't know. I would suspect the West Coast would be the most liberal because it is on other ish related matters. So.
Mhm. What about religious-based shelters? Did you contact a shelter that might be Christian or Muslim-based? And if so, how did they approach the issue?
Yeah, I did. And I did look for a few like that just out of curiosity. I mean, I found one with a name, the one in Baltimore, that
Hmm.
let me think this is Muslim affiliated. And
Oh,
um, and it and I got to have a nice long conversation. The woman who answered the phone turned out to be the founder and the administrator, the director. She was a real fireball, and she had
hmm.
founded it to give women, she said, to practice their faith, who needed a shelter, a place to
Right.
go, and were absolutely adamant about not letting males in, even boys who had of a certain age, I mean, quite young, 8 or so, because they knew that these boys could have been horribly influenced by their mother's abusers
Wow.
when they were still together. And in one case, it was known to be the case, it was awful that this
Hmm.
boy was meant to witness the
Yes.
sex between her abuser and his mom. And so they said, we can't let boys like that in because they're going to be prone to want to act out some of those behaviors. It's just too dangerous.
Hmm.
So they were very, very strict on their position.
Wow.
Um, one I didn't get to ask in Boise, the one in Chicago, neither. I'm thinking, well, the one in Memphis is YWCA affiliated,
Right.
Women's Christian Association, but then the one in another state, a Y,
Hmm.
they're very strong on admitting males. So,
Right.
and then one in Little Rock is affiliated with a Christian denomination. So, um, I would think that may have, influenced their
Hmm.
values too,
Hmm.
for sure. But
Wow,
that was
that's
interesting.
it.
I did not get to
Yes.
ask the question. I did not just, I mean, I didn't include it in my script. I didn't, as
Right.
far as systematically asking or checking the website to see if all the others that do admit males, what their affiliation
Hmm.
might be, if there was any with the church or
Hmm.
religious group.
Okay.
So
Hmm. Is there anything else in your research that particularly shocked you? Is there anything else that you want viewers to know about this issue?
I wasn't shocked, but I get well, just really disturbed by the staunch defense of the policy by the women I talked to. It was all women, the hotline
Hmm.
that I spoke with. And I guess it was understandable. I mean, whatever, they had a job or they were
Right.
volunteer. They didn't want to get crosswise with the policy, even if they didn't fully buy into it. But
Right.
they sure were quick to defend it, and others seemed like they really truly believed it. Yeah, that was disturbing. I mean, not only that they defended the policy, but they defended the idea that a man can be a woman if he says he's a woman. That was, I mean, that was mind-blowing. And to me,
Right.
though, really, this is part of what's been going on for a while, over a number of years in our society, that people, for a variety of reasons, have shut down critical thinking. I mean, there are a lot of people who are now not buying just what they're fed in the mainstream media about different issues, but I feel like a lot of people, they're under, tremendous stress, economic, fearful. They don't want to be booted from their tribe or the circle of friends and
Right.
family they depend on, or their political affiliation. I mean, I'm an independent now, but I'm
Right.
registered. I'm an independent now. I was a Democrat, and yeah, it's lonely.
Right.
Where and so
Right.
there are a lot of, but people are really just, or it's like they're thinking about so many things.
Yes.
It's like this is one more thing that they really don't want to put on their plate,
Right.
think
So
about. And
what?
that's, anyway, so that was disturbing. And then the
Yes.
other thing really is that, in this, when I talk to them about the admission of males and why,
Hmm.
it was always about the prerogative of the males.
Oh my
You know,
goodness.
it always was. It was like, well, what do they want? We want them to feel, I mean, they actually sometimes said, we want them to feel comfortable where they're housed. Now, if they want to go to another shelter where there are more people who identify like they do, we'll refer them, or, if some of them offered vouchers to hotels, or if there was like at a particular shelter, there were a few shelters that have a
Wow.
entirely separate unit for males. And so
Hmm.
these guys who claim to be women, they're, in those cases, they're given the choice. Would you like to stay in the male unit or the women's
Oh
unit,
my
or what?
goodness.
And they don't want to go to the males. I mean, one of them flat out
Yeah.
said it. They're going to be harassed there. They don't want to be with other men. They want to be with the women. Well, how do the women feel about it? Oh, they seem
Right.
fine. I mean, we haven't had any complaints. They understand that these guys, they may feel a little uncomfortable at first, but they don't say these
Hmm.
guys, women, these trans ladies, they've been abused too. Well, that may be. That's a different issue. But
Hmm.
yeah, put them in a separate space for them. So it was about what
What the men want.
there's me, it just reminded me, it's like so many other things that are coming out with the men in sports and so on, women's sports, the misogyny and the
Hmm.
putting the preferences over men just
Yes.
comes up time and again. So
Exactly.
that was,
Exactly.
anyway, it just underscored that
Hmm.
uh, to me.
Right. One other question. Do you plan on doing any more of this type of research, or would you, or what would you like to do to further this type of research or any other type of research that you might feel is important?
Well, I can think of, I feel like to me on this topic that the thing
Hmm.
that I think would be great, it's an undertaking and I'm not signing up
Hmm.
for is
Right.
you said to be able to talk to women who are
Hmm.
either in shelters currently or have been. I mean, most ideally, the ones that I spoke with, to
Right.
hear about their feelings and experiences.
Yes.
Because
Right.
that's what I think needs to happen. And that, I mean, it would take finding volunteers in those
Yes.
locations and asking
Hmm.
them if, in creating a plan for the research and seeing if they would, I get, try
Wow.
to figure out a way to talk to these women. And sometimes if you can find one person, kind of
Hmm.
you can pull a thread and find more. They know
Hmm.
other
That's
women
true.
who've been in the shelter, and so it snowballs. It's called snowball sampling, and so you can,
Right.
it just takes work to get it going.
Hmm.
Um, when I briefly was a newspaper reporter for some small papers in the area where I
Hmm.
live, talking to people on the street, and I mean, God, I was constantly amazed and rewarded and humbled by what I would learn from people all the time. It is the most fascinating thing that
Right.
you just learn so much in really talking to people who've experienced something. And
Hmm.
I feel like if we could get a few volunteers that wanted to do that,
Right.
um, I think they could get pretty fired up about it. But that's one thing. I mean, that seems like maybe I think it's important with research, um, to think about, well, then what are we going to do with this information? What kind of impact is this going to have?
Right.
And I think that's the
Mhm.
main thing that comes to mind. There may be other ideas people would have. The other one would be, which is just not, curious, and it could lead to some really fascinating things. You don't know what you're going to find, is
Mhm.
somehow with some of these shelters, to understand what the evolution was over time from when they were founded and when they were women's only shelter.
Mhm.
What were the drivers behind the shift in policy, either
Right.
with funding or ideology and that sort of thing? That's a real academic project, and it could take some
Right.
time. I mean, I found out when I was doing my research that the oldest shelter in Canada, I mean, a much revered
Mhm.
agency in Vancouver, took a stand against this, and they were just
Oh,
reviled and lost all
yes.
their public funding. And so the pressures are severe, the repercussions are severe for these shelters
Wow.
if they cause a stir. So
It's
um,
tyranny.
anyway, yeah. So anyway,
Wow.
those two things come to mind. I'm kind of taking a break from signing up for research projects right now. I've got my hands full. I've got a
Okay.
small business, and
Okay.
anyway. But in the future, because I love gathering facts and putting them together in a way
Yes.
that makes sense to people and can be compelling in terms of
Mhm.
making people think about certain policies and so forth.
Right.
And um, so, I mean, I love
Wow.
doing that kind of work. So I
Well,
was very grateful to the board to
mhm.
offer this to me. I found it to be interesting. It wasn't easy. I didn't like pretending I wasn't somebody that I am, when I called the shelters. But that, as a journalist, you're
Mhm.
quite justified in doing that. If you have no
Mhm.
other recourse but to fib about who you are in order to get
Right.
the information, and there's no other path in the
Mhm.
value publicly of doing that, overrides any harms that could come from your telling a
Right.
fib about who you are, then it's, according to journalistic ethics, that's quite
Right.
permissible. So
Right.
anyway,
Well, the board actually thanks you for doing this research. And if you would like to read the research yourself, you can just click at the link below. And also, if you are so inclined to sign the declaration, and I sincerely hope you are, please click on the link below and sign. Nancy Docktor, thank you so much for your research.
you are so
Thank you.
welcome.
Okay.
Thanks for the WDI and all the great work.